The sun rested low on the horizon, casting Lexington, Kentucky, in a breathtaking golden glow that painted the streets with warmth. Officer Mark Anderson adjusted his rearview mirror inside his parked patrol car, his eyes scanning the steady stream of traffic ahead. Beside him, his partner, Emily Carter, absent-mindedly tapped her pen against a notepad, jotting down notes from their earlier call. The two were stationed near Ashland Avenue, where the scenery seamlessly transitioned from modest single-family homes to polished, upscale condominiums. It was in this tranquil moment that Mark's gaze locked onto a sleek black car gliding past them. The vehicle exuded sophistication, its polished surface reflecting the setting sun. Behind the wheel sat a confident African-American woman dressed in a sharp, tailored navy blue suit. Her hair was meticulously styled, and her posture radiated elegance and composure. Something about her demeanor seemed to spark irritation in Mark. "Take a look at that," he muttered under his breath, disdain dripping from his tone. "Fancy car like that. Bet she's up to something." Emily glanced up from her notes, her brows furrowing slightly. "She's not speeding or breaking any laws," she replied carefully. "What's the problem, Mark?" Mark ignored her words entirely, his hand instinctively reaching for the patrol car's flashing lights. "Let's find out," he said with a smirk, pulling onto the road to trail the vehicle. The driver noticed them quickly, slowing down and signaling before pulling over to the curb with practiced precision. Emily watched as the woman's shoulders seemed to stiffen slightly through the car's rear window. Mark parked and stepped out, his posture tense and assertive. "Mark, this doesn't sit right," Emily whispered, hurrying after him. Her voice was low but firm. "You don't even have probable cause." "Stay back, rookie," Mark snapped, his hand brushing against his holster. "I've been on this job for 20 years. I know a suspect when I see one." As they approached, the car's window rolled down smoothly, revealing the driver, Grace Williams. Her expression was calm yet cautious, her dark eyes carefully assessing the officers before her. "Good evening, officers," Grace said evenly, her voice calm yet guarded. "Is there a problem?" Mark leaned closer, his imposing figure casting a shadow across the car's interior. "License and registration," he barked, blatantly ignoring her question. Grace moved her hands slowly and deliberately, retrieving her documents and placing them on the dashboard before sliding them over. Emily observed closely, her attention drawn to the faint tremor in Grace's fingers. It wasn't fear of guilt that Emily sensed, it was apprehension toward Mark's unnecessarily aggressive demeanor. "What brings you to this part of town, Miss Williams?" Mark asked curtly as he inspected her documents, his tone sharp and probing. Grace tilted her head slightly, keeping her composure. "I'm on my way to a meeting," she replied, her voice steady. Mark's lip curled into a sneer. "Must be some meeting if you're driving a car like this." Emily felt unease settle deep in her stomach as the tension escalated. Passers-by began to glance in their direction, their curiosity piqued by the unfolding scene. "Mark, she's cooperating," Emily said quietly, stepping closer. "Let's not escalate this." But Mark was already yanking at the car door. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice firm and unyielding. Grace's calm facade faltered momentarily. "Is there a reason for this?" she asked, her tone measured but firm. "I said step out," Mark growled, pulling the door open with force. Grace unbuckled her seatbelt with deliberate movements, stepping onto the pavement with quiet dignity. Emily's heart raced as she watched Mark grab Grace's arm with unwarranted aggression, pulling her toward the car. Grace stumbled but quickly steadied herself, her expression a mix of shock and resolve. "That's enough," Emily burst out, stepping forward despite the tremor in her voice. She planted herself firmly between Mark and Grace. "She hasn't done anything wrong." Mark shot her a sharp glare. "Stay out of this, rookie," he spat. Grace adjusted her jacket, standing tall despite the tension in the air. "This is harassment, Officer Anderson," she said, her voice unwavering. "I know my rights." Mark smirked, leaning closer. "Out here, your rights are whatever I say they are." Emily stood frozen, a storm of emotions swirling within her, fear, anger, and a growing sense of responsibility. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was a moment charged with deeper, more complex implications. The situation teetered on the edge of chaos, with Mark's grip tightening on Grace's arm as bystanders looked on in silent anticipation of what would come next. As Grace stepped aside, her bag slipped from her shoulder, spilling its contents across the pavement. Keys clinked as they hit the ground, accompanied by a phone and a small notepad. Grace inhaled deeply, steadying herself before exhaling sharply. Despite the situation, she kept her composure. "This is entirely unnecessary," she said, her voice clipped but controlled. "I've complied with every single thing you've asked of me." Mark scoffed, crouching to sift through the scattered items without permission. His movements were slow, deliberate, as though he were searching for something, anything, that might justify his increasingly questionable behavior. "What's a woman like you doing driving a car like this?" he muttered, his tone oozing with condescension. Emily stepped forward, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Her voice was tense but resolute. "Mark, this isn't protocol. We don't have probable cause to search her belongings." Without even looking up, Mark waved her off dismissively. "You've got a lot to learn, rookie. This is how you keep the streets clean." Grace's tone shifted, her voice hardening as she addressed him. "Officer Anderson, you're violating my rights. You have no legal reason to search my property." Mark straightened, holding up one of her credit cards like it was damning evidence. His smirk was insufferable. "You don't get to lecture me, lady. You're in my town now." A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk, their murmurs growing louder as more people pulled out their phones to record the unfolding drama. Grace noticed the cameras but refused to look away from Mark, her steady gaze locked on him. Emily's chest tightened as her eyes caught a small, subtle movement. Mark had stepped back toward the patrol car, his hand dipping into his pocket. Her pulse quickened when she saw a small plastic bag slip between his fingers, a bag that hadn't come from Grace's belongings. "Mark," Emily hissed, her voice barely audible over the murmuring crowd. "What are you doing?" He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned into Grace's car and discreetly slid the bag under the driver's seat. Then, with dramatic flair, he turned to face the onlookers, holding up the bag of white powder like a prize. Well, Mark announced loudly, his voice laced with mockery. "Looks like we've got a little drug situation here." Grace's eyes widened, a mix of shock and fury flashing across her face. "That's not mine," she said firmly, stepping toward him. "You just planted that in my car." Mark smirked, his mockery dripping like venom. "That's a nice story, Miss Williams. But it won't hold up." The crowd grew restless, their murmurs turning into voices of disbelief and outrage. Emily felt a wave of nausea rise within her. She had seen it, Mark planting the evidence. She knew it was wrong, knew she had to say something, but fear held her frozen in place. Grace turned her piercing gaze to Emily, her eyes pleading. "You saw what he did. Please say something." Emily's throat tightened, her voice caught between the weight of her conscience and the fear of retaliation. She could feel Mark's eyes burning into her, daring her to speak. His gaze seemed to say, "Stay quiet or you'll regret it." But Emily couldn't unsee what had just happened. The image of Mark slipping the bag into Grace's car was seared into her mind. Her father's words echoed in her head, a lesson he had repeated countless times. "Integrity isn't easy, but it's what makes you a good person." "Mark," Emily said, her voice trembling but audible. "This isn't right." Mark spun on her, his face darkening with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about. Keep your mouth shut." Grace stood her ground, her voice unwavering despite the anger coursing through her. "You can't intimidate your way out of this, Officer Anderson. I know exactly what's happening here, and so does your partner." Mark took a step closer to Grace, his hand resting ominously near his holster. "You think you're untouchable just because you drive a nice car? Let me tell you something. That's enough." Emily snapped, her voice louder than she intended. Her heart was racing, pounding against her ribcage, but she didn't back down. "You're crossing the line." The crowd had grown significantly, and the weight of their stares bore down on the tense scene. Mark hesitated, his eyes darting to the onlookers, their phones capturing every moment. His jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Grace exhaled deeply, her expression a mix of relief and defiance. She turned to Emily, her voice calm but resolute. "Thank you for speaking up. But this isn't over." Emily nodded, a spark of determination igniting in her chest. For the first time, she felt a flicker of purpose, a certainty that doing what was right outweighed the fear. Mark's sneer deepened as he redirected his attention to Grace, his voice dropping to a menacing growl meant only for her. "You think you're smarter than me? You think these people are going to help you?" Grace met his glare with unwavering resolve, her voice as sharp as a blade. "I don't think, Officer Anderson. I know I'm smarter than you. And you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." For a fleeting moment, Mark's composure faltered, but he quickly masked it with a scoff, pulling out his handcuffs and stepping toward Grace. "You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance," he said coldly. Emily's breath caught in her throat. This was it, the moment she had dreaded, the moment she had to choose between her career and her conscience. Her father's words echoed in her mind, louder and more insistent than ever. "If you don't stand up for what's right, you're just as guilty as the ones who do wrong." "No," Emily said suddenly, her voice slicing through the heavy tension like a knife. She stepped between Mark and Grace, her hands raised defensively. "This isn't right, and you know it." Mark's face flushed with rage. "Move out of the way, rookie. Don't make me report you for insubordination." Emily's voice wavered, but she stood her ground. "You planted that evidence. I saw you. And I won't be a part of this." The crowd gasped, a ripple of shock spreading through the onlookers. Grace's expression softened slightly as she looked at Emily, her gaze steady and grateful. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. Mark's fury boiled over. He stepped closer to Emily, jabbing a finger toward her chest. "You're done. Do you hear me? I'll make sure you never wear that badge again." Emily squared her shoulders, summoning every ounce of courage within her. "If that's what it takes to do the right thing, so be it." Grace, sensing the moment was teetering on the edge of escalation, decided to act. Her voice was steady and commanding as she spoke. "Officer Anderson, I suggest you think very carefully about your next move." Mark laughed bitterly, though his confidence was starting to waver. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" Grace reached into her jacket pocket, her movements slow and deliberate. Both officers tensed, their instincts heightened, but Grace remained composed. She pulled out a leather badge holder, flipping it open to reveal her credentials. "My name is Captain Grace Williams," she said, her tone calm yet firm. "I'm the new commanding officer for this precinct." For a moment, silence blanketed the scene. Mark stared at the badge, his mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. Emily felt her knees weaken as the weight of the revelation settled in. That's not possible," Mark stammered, his bravado crumbling. You can't be." Grace cut him off, her voice slicing through his protests. "You didn't even bother to ask before deciding I was a criminal, did you? But it shouldn't matter who I am. Every single person deserves to be treated with respect, not judged by the color of their skin or the car they drive." Mark's face paled as the crowd erupted into a mix of cheers, murmurs, and angry shouts. The gravity of what he had done, the sheer injustice, was now laid bare for everyone to see. Emily took a small step back, her mind spinning as she tried to process everything. Grace turned to her, her expression softening. "Officer Carter," she said, her voice warm yet resolute, "thank you for finding the courage to speak up. It's not easy, but it's the right thing to do." Emily swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she replied. "I should have done it sooner. I'm sorry." Grace nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "You did it when it mattered. That's what counts." Mark, still reeling from the shock, finally found his voice. "Captain, I can explain." "No." Grace cut him off sharply, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You can't. What you did today goes against everything this badge stands for. Hand over your weapon and badge. You're suspended, effective immediately." Mark's hands trembled as he unclipped his badge and holster. His face twisted with anger and disbelief as he glared at Grace. "You can't do this. You don't know what it's like out here. I've been protecting these streets for 20 years. Grace's expression remained unwavering, her voice firm and resolute. "Protecting these streets?
No.
Today, you betrayed the trust of the people you swore to serve. This is not what justice looks like." The weight of her words lingered in the air as the crowd watched in stunned silence, their phones still recording the moment that would undoubtedly ripple far beyond Ashland Avenue. Grace's expression sharpened as she stepped closer to Mark, her words cutting like glass. "Protecting? Is that what you call this? How many lives have you destroyed with your prejudice, Mark? How many people have you framed to feed your ego?" The crowd, now emboldened by Grace's presence, erupted into shouts of indignation. A woman at the front yelled, "You're a disgrace to the uniform." Another voice added, "We've been dealing with this for years." Emily's eyes darted across the growing crowd, her nerves fraying. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. It was about a system that had allowed officers like him to operate unchecked for far too long. Grace stepped forward, her voice resonating with authority, silencing the commotion. "This isn't just about me," she declared, addressing the crowd directly. "It's about holding people like him accountable. It's about making sure that no one is above the law, not even the ones sworn to uphold it." Mark's face reddened with anger as he took a step closer to Grace. "You think you're some kind of hero? You don't know what it's like to deal with the real criminals out here. You sit behind a desk while I'm out risking my life." Grace raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unwavering. "And you think that justifies planting evidence? Using your authority to intimidate and degrade innocent people? You're not risking your life, Mark. You're ruining others." Emily's chest tightened as she watched the exchange, the stark cracks in the system laid bare before her. She had always known they existed, but seeing them up close was overwhelming. Grace turned her attention to Emily, her voice softening but still firm. "Officer Carter," she said, "I know this isn't easy for you, but speaking up today took courage. Don't lose that." Emily nodded slowly, her voice trembling. "I won't." Mark, still clutching his badge, looked at Grace with a mix of resentment and desperation. "You're making a mistake, Captain. People like you don't last long in this job." Grace took a step closer, her eyes locking onto his. "People like me? You mean people who believe in justice? Who believe in equality? If that's a mistake, it's one I'll gladly make." The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers drowning out Mark's feeble protests. Grace turned to a bystander holding a phone and said, "Thank you for recording this. Make sure it gets shared." Mark's face twisted in fury. "You're throwing me under the bus for optics. This is all a show." Grace didn't flinch.
"No, Mark.
"This is accountability, something you clearly don't understand." The wail of approaching sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of backup. Grace stood tall, her presence commanding. Mark reluctantly handed over his badge and holster, his shoulders slumping as his bravado crumbled under the weight of what had just unfolded. Emily watched, a storm of emotions swirling within her, relief, guilt, and a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in years. A second patrol car pulled up, and two officers stepped out, their eyes darting between the crowd and the scene before them. Grace waved them over, her voice steady. "Officers, escort Mr. Anderson to the precinct. He's suspended pending a full investigation." Mark's face turned a deeper shade of red as he spluttered. "You can't be serious. This is my precinct. My team." Grace didn't even glance at him. "Not anymore." The crowd cheered as the officers reluctantly led Mark away. Some shouted words of support for Grace, while others demanded justice for the countless people Mark had wronged over the years. Grace turned back to the crowd, her voice rising above the noise. "This is just the beginning," she said, her tone resolute. "Today, we're taking a stand against corruption and prejudice. But it doesn't stop here. It's up to all of us to demand accountability and ensure our system works for everyone." The crowd responded with a wave of applause and shouts of agreement. Emily felt a lump form in her throat as she realized the magnitude of the moment. This wasn't just about Grace or Mark. It was about the community reclaiming its trust in those meant to protect them. As the scene began to wind down, Grace approached Emily, her expression softening. "You did the right thing today," she said gently. "I know it wasn't easy." Emily nodded, her voice barely audible. "I was scared. I didn't know if I'd lose everything." Grace placed a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. "You didn't lose anything that matters. Integrity is what defines us, not the badge." Emily blinked back tears, a sense of pride filling her for the first time since she'd joined the force. In that moment, she understood what it truly meant to serve and protect. A local news crew arrived, cameras already rolling. Grace took a deep breath, knowing the spotlight was about to shine brighter than ever. She turned to the camera, her voice calm but firm. "What happened here today is a reminder that no one is above the law, not even those sworn to enforce it," she said. "We have a long way to go, but change starts with moments like this." As the crew captured her every word, Emily stepped back, letting Grace take the lead. She glanced at the crowd, now dispersing but leaving behind a renewed sense of hope and determination. For Emily, this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where she could finally live up to the oath she had taken. For Grace, it was an opportunity to reshape a broken system from within. And for the community, it was a spark that could ignite a larger movement for justice. As the sirens faded into the distance and Mark's patrol car disappeared down the road, Grace and Emily stood side by side, ready to face whatever came next.